Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Nā iwi mana whenua o Aotearoa, tēnā koutou. E mihi ana ki nā tohu o Nehi o Tamaki Makaurau. Just lost my words. But I know this bit. Ko Ngati Pākehā te iwi. Ko Leonie Morris tōku ingoa. Ko ahau te kai whakahaere ko te wahi wahine o Tamaki Makaurau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone. I'm Leonie Morris, the manager of the Auckland Women's Centre. A warm welcome to this korero where we are imagining the best possible futures for wahine Māori and other women. Tonight we are with two Auckland Women's Centre favourites, Laura O'Connell Rapira and Stacey Morrison. Our kawa for this korero is to ensure everyone's safety, keeping participants' microphones switched off. There'll be a chance later in the evening for audience questions, so please write these in the chat panel. The Auckland Women's Centre is proud to present this korero to you as part of its program of public forums. Recent forums have included a korero with Dr. Henimore Elder and another with Professor Tracy McIntosh. Recordings of both of these forums are available on our Facebook page, and we will add the links into the Zoom chat. I'm pleased to say that the Auckland Women's Centre has reopened after the Rarawa. Community classes are starting up again, as well as counselling, while our support groups and high school project remain online for now. You might enjoy checking out our Tuia Te Papa Facebook page for rangatahi, which is exploring decolonising feminism in Aotearoa. As you will appreciate, tonight's korero comes with costs, and we would love you to donate if you can. Link to donate will be put in the chat panel. Thank you very much for your ongoing support. Make no mistake, COVID-19 is creating the biggest global recession for generations, and with that comes hardship, particularly for women, and unless we all work for change, particularly for Māori women and other disadvantaged groups. But at the same time, the fact that at the moment our government is spending tens of billions of dollars more than usual also creates opportunities for us to think big and transform the systems. Here to jog our most innovative, creative and exciting ideas are Laura O'Connell Rapira and Stacey Morrison. We're honoured to welcome Laura back tonight. As Director of Action Station, she is one of the country's best placed people to talk about future hopes and how to get there. She has been living and breathing decolonisation and equitable social transformation for years now. We are also delighted to welcome back broadcaster and Te Reo Māori advocate, Stacey Morrison. Those of you fortunate enough to attend Stacey's korero with Henimore Elder know that Stacey brings warmth, araha and smart questions with her. So it is with pleasure and huge admiration that I hand over to Stacey now. Nō reira, kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you.
Mauri ora. Tēnā rawa atu koe iwe nā kupu mehi. Tūtawa mai runga, tūtawa mai raro, tūtawa mai roto, tūtawa mai waho. Kia tau ai te Māori tū, te Māori ora ki te katoa. Haumi e, hui e, tae ki e. Aha koa e ki tēnā tātou mata ki te mata, kaua ko te kanohi ki te kanohi. He oranga wairua tonu te kite i a koutou katoa. It's wonderful to see you all in this unusual way, but it's a way that I guess we show that we are in the same space. Aha koa kare tātou te kite i a tātou, we're in the same space of kōrero, we're in the same space of what we want to engage in, and I can see you all in the gallery right now. He oranga wairua, that's why I say it feels beautiful to see you all. So I'm going to send you a hongi from afar, ha mamau, kia koutou katoa. I send the breath of life and of Māori, kia tātou katoa. It's beautiful to see some of our men with us as well. Māori ora kia tātou. Also some applause, and I'm just aware too that everyone will be able to participate in their own way. It's actually quite a big thing having hui topa, zui as they call it, And it is quite draining. So I just want to recognize that it's taken a lot for you all to be here today. I am in the bunk of my daughter's room. This is the only place that it's fairly likely that I might not be interrupted. Hoia no, ko waika mohio, we don't know. Meantime, Miss Laura there with her perfectly composed background. Atahua tonu tēnā. And we've given you such a big job today. But these are such big times that we need to try to lift ourselves above the current mamai, ahotea, all of those difficult things. And so we put to you, Laura, e mohi anau ki a koe, tō maia, tō kaha ki te whāki i ngā kōrero pono, ngā kōrero e tika ana kia puta ki te whai au ki te ao marama. So because of your bravery, the place that you stand for all of us, tēnā rawa atu koe, i te whakaaro nui, kia tai mai ki tēnei hui o tātou. He uri tēnei, no te Atiawa, Ngapuhi, te Rarawa, and Ngati Whakaue, so that means that all of us will try to claim you in some way. Kia kaha tātou ki te rapu whakaaro mo ngā pātai, so we're going to think of our questions and know that as talented as Laura is, we can't ask you to fix the entire world. I mean, obviously, I want you to have a vaccine for COVID by the end of this. Hoia no, e kare, aha koa ngā āhotanga katoa o te wā, tēnei kamihi ki a koe, kai a koe te wā.
Yeah, kia ora tātou. Thank you to the Auckland Women's Centre for inviting me today. Thank you, Leonie, and thank you, Stacey, for hosting as well. And thank you to everyone that's tuned in. I really like this ability to still sort of see you all. It gives it that live event vibe, which I actually really miss. So it's really lovely to see you all. Thank you for taking time out of your Tuesday evening to tune in. So yeah, I'm the director of Action Station, and for those who don't know, Action Station is an independent, mostly crowd-funded community campaigning organisation, and we use the internet to organise our community of over 100,000 people who live all around the country to act together in creative, coordinated ways to work towards a thriving and tiriti honouring Aotearoa. We are non-partisan, but we're not apolitical, which means that we organise around our shared values, our vision for the future of Aotearoa, rather than rallying around specific political parties. And for 99% of the campaigns that we run, we collaborate with other NGOs or community groups or academic experts or people who have lived experience who are also experts. So we're really big believers in this idea of, you know, lots of people coming together and acting in big and small ways to create enduring change. So as you all know, I've been invited today to speak about what kind of future we want for women, particularly wahine Māori after COVID-19. And the question that was posed to me, or the brief that was given to me, was very much framed around the economic spending. But if you will indulge me, I'm going to be somewhat fluid with that brief. And tonight I'm going to talk about my personal connection to this kaupapa and the importance of grounding the decisions that we make from here in Indigenous values, because I really think that our shared values and our vision that guides us and the decisions that we make are more important in some ways than the ingredients or the policies we choose to get there. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I think that is as we go through the Korero. So first, a little bit about me. For the first 7 years of my life, I was raised mostly by my mum on the Domestic Purposes Benefit, the DPB. My dad has always been a big part of my life. He still is. Just my mum and dad's relationship wasn't meant to be. Both my mum and my dad are Māori. They're both one of 8, so big whānau. And both of them grew up, like too many of our whānau out there, unfortunately, disconnected from te reo, from tikanga, because of the colonising laws that were put in place that punished their grandparents for speaking and practising our reo and our culture. I was happened in May when the government at that time passed the mother of all budgets. So in 1991, Ruth Richardson, the finance minister at the time, believed somehow that jobs would miraculously appear for people if she slashed the unemployment benefit, the family's benefit, and the sickness benefit. Now, obviously, it's a very strange belief to think that cutting support to sick people, solo parents, working class families somehow helps them to live happy and healthy lives, but it's an ideology that sadly has pervaded Labour and national policy ever since. My mum and I, we lived with my granddad and my auntie in Mangere at this time. There are a lot of families in our neighbourhood who relied on income support. In South Auckland in the 1980s, unemployment was around 40 to 50%. The stock market crash in 1987 meant there were huge job losses, similar to the situation that we are facing now. And to be honest, the only reason my mum and I really got by was because we had whānau support, but of course not everyone is that lucky. And the 1980s really was the beginning of a very long period of low wages, flattened benefits, and high housing costs. So really for my entire life, people in government have underinvested in key services like public housing and income support, and the types of policies that really would have helped low-income families like mine. Instead, people in government have prioritised policies that help people who are already well off. And so in this current in the last kind of 10 years, I would say property speculators have been the really obvious example there. There was a New Zealand Herald investigation last year that found property speculators made an average of $70,000 a sale, while most families in poverty have housing costs that take up over half of their income. So it's a huge disparity there. Now, for the past 2 elections, New Zealanders have overwhelmingly said that child poverty is one of their #1 concerns. But unfortunately, the framing of child poverty has meant that we have pushed people towards band-aid solutions that look at helping just the child and not recognising that the only reason that child is in poverty is because their family is in poverty. The adults in their life are in poverty. Too many people would rather buy Eat My Lunch than say, support policies that would actually redistribute wealth in this country to end poverty for good. And I can't, it's somewhat understandable that people hold those positions because we have been dealing with 30 years of regressive economic policy and quite lazy beneficiary bashing from opportunistic politicians who would rather blame people on benefits than, accept that there has been huge government neglect and government failure. And that punitive attitude towards people on benefits, unfortunately, continues today. This is a very timely discussion to be having because, of course, just yesterday, the Finance Minister announced a new benefit for people who have lost their jobs because of COVID. This benefit is almost $500 a week. It's not going to be taxed. And that is double what people who were unemployed before COVID hit are able to get. And so what we've essentially done is create a 2-tiered benefit system at the moment. And you could call me cynical, but I think it's worth pointing out that many of the people who were on benefits prior to COVID are people who are Māori, people who are solo parents, people who have disabilities or illnesses or addictions. And 65% of the people who have lost their job because of COVID and now applied for benefits are Pākehā. And they're also likely voters. So you could call me cynical, but quite frankly, I think it is. I think it's a move to win voters before the election, and I think it's atrocious. Which brings me to the importance of our values and our shared vision. So in 2017, we organised Action Station members to gather in town halls and cafes and community centres, in each other's homes. One person even organised one of these events in their local McDonald's in Gisborne. We were asking people, Action Station members, to come together to imagine what we want the future of the country to look like in 2040. We decided to do this because we had read the Māteke Mai report, which is the work of Moana Jackson and Professor Margaret Mutu, who travelled around the country. They spoke to thousands of Māori across 250 hui, where they had imagined the future of the country in 2040. And one of the calls that came from that report was for tangata tiriti, people who are here by virtue of the treaty, so our treaty partners. One of the calls was for tangata tiriti to do the same kind of work. And so Action Station is a predominant, our membership, like our country, is predominantly made up of tangata tiriti. And so we decided to take up that call and organise these events. And I also really like the idea of asking people to imagine what the future of the country will be like in 2040, because it's long enough into the future to invite imaginative thinking, but it's also close enough for us to imagine how our actions today can influence what life will be like for people living in 2040. And so the way that those conversations worked is that someone would volunteer to be the host of a discussion, and then we would send them out a host pack with instructions about how to facilitate this korero. And so there were 3 rounds. The first round was answering the question, what value do you think needs to be at the heart of government decision making in order for us to have a fair and flourishing Aotearoa by 2040? And people would have 22 values cards laid out on the table in front of them, and they were written in English and written in Māori. And there were things like equality and fairness, aroha, manakitanga, kaitiakitanga, but also power, security, wealth, those sorts of things. So people would pick up one of those values and they would explain why they have chosen that as being the most important value for government decision making. So that was the first round. The second round was that the host would read one of 6 stories, which were common experiences of marginalisation or neglect in New Zealand. So we had the story of a river from the perspective of the river, a low-income family on the brink of homelessness, a mum who was seeking mental health help for her child in rural New Zealand, a young person who was facing a prison sentence for a low-level drug offence, and a person from a refugee background who was just settling into New Zealand. And so then the question, so the host would read that story, which would be about 2 minutes long, and then the question would be, if the value that you chose was at the heart of government decision making, how would the story play out differently? And we found that to be an incredibly powerful way to have conversations about systems, about politics, especially for people who, unlike me, are not paid to think about politics on the daily, and they're who don't have the benefit, I guess, of reading a lot about various policy or academic papers on whatever issue it might be that we're reading academic papers on. And so we also found it was also a really great way to reduce the likelihood of stereotypes coming up for people, because because people can connect to real human stories as opposed to just kind of numbers and statistics on a spreadsheet. So that was the second question that we asked. And also, I guess what we were really blown away by was the breadth and the depth of people's vision when we start a conversation based on values. So what I thought I could do today is I thought that I could talk a little bit about the values that I think need to be guiding our government's decision making as we move beyond the COVID crisis, and a little bit about how things may be different if we decide to do that. And so the first value I'm going to talk about is whakapapa, which is the long and never-ending line from the atua or the gods to the whenua, the land, to our tupuna, our ancestors, to us, to our descendants. And if we think about whakapapa as a key principle for guiding our decisions, then what that means is that we recognise that Papa Tuanuku is our Earth Mother. And it means that we acknowledge that all political and economic decisions need to be made with the health of Papa Tuanuku in mind first. And that's quite different than the economy that we've had over the last however many decades, that really doesn't prioritise the health of our planet or our people over the private profit of corporations and those who have concentrated wealth for their own benefit. And so what that means in practice is if we base all of our decisions on the health, all of our economic and political decisions on the health of Papa Tuanuku, it means that what we're deciding to do is we want to shift resources away from things like intensive agriculture towards regenerative farming. It means prioritising things like free and accessible public transport for everyone instead of funding more motorways and roads. It means investing more money in low carbon jobs, the kinds of jobs that involve caring for one another, healing other people, teaching people, nursing, gardening, planting, the arts, writing. All of those are low carbon jobs, and at the moment most of those jobs are not very well paid. And so if we're serious about building the kinds of society that prioritises the health of Papa Tuanuku, then we want to incentivise people to enter into jobs that are healthy for Papa Tuanuku, and the way to do that is, one way to do that, among other things such as mana, status, etc. attached to jobs, is to make sure that those jobs are dignified, secure and well paid. I think we could be thinking about some kind of green care job guarantee, which is that anyone who wants to can access training and pathways to secure and dignified employment in jobs that care for people and the planet. I think we need to be careful that we don't risk repeating something like a work for the dole scheme, but I do think that there are ways for us to do that. Whakapapa is also about thinking beyond electoral cycles. It's about thinking long-term, thinking about our descendants 7 generations down the line, and what is it that would benefit them. Now, unfortunately, in New Zealand, we do have a political system or political decision-making that is dominated by the imported Westminster parliamentary system, which is just not equipped for long-term thinking. And one of the reasons for that is because we have 3-year electoral cycles, which means that political parties are really spending about half of that time campaigning to win the next election, right? And so there's been a call going for a long time that we need to extend that electoral cycle to 4 years to enable more to happen, and I would agree with that. But I also think that government needs to be devolving more of their decisions and more of their responsibilities and more of their funding to communities, to hapu, to iwi, because communities, hapu, iwi, they have roots in the communities that they belong to, and they can deliver projects better over the long term than a centralised government can in many cases. And so I would like to see more of that happen beyond COVID. The second value is rangatiratanga, which in the Māori world, leaders are called rangatira, which means to weave people together. And of course, tino rangatiratanga means self-determination. And over the years, there has been a growing chorus of calls for the Crown to live into the promise of Te Tiriti o Waitangi by sharing power with Māori, as was always intended when our tupuna signed, well, when some of our tupuna signed that treaty all those years ago. And we have seen that call intensify over the last couple of weeks, with Māori calling out the government's treatment of things like the tangihanga rules, the iwi checkpoints, and the urgent public health response bill that gave agents of the state the ability to enter into any marae or home that they want to without a warrant. Now, if we truly valued rangatiratanga, it would mean that the government would not have made any of those decisions without the full participation of Māori. And that is where we need to be heading towards. Valuing rangatiratanga also means making sure whānau, hapu and iwi have enough resources to care for whānau, hapu and iwi in a way that works for them. This government has spent 6 times more on the wage subsidy in the past couple of months than the entire 30-year history of treaty reparations, which is my preferred term for treaty settlements, because of course, as Moana Jackson says, the treaty was never meant to be settled, it was meant to be honoured. The government actually spends more in 2 years on prisons, locking people up, mostly Māori, than they have on the entire history of treaty settlements. And so, when I think about that, I think of Ngapuhi, one of my iwi. We are one of the most incarcerated, I think the most incarcerated tribe in the world. And we also have some of the highest levels of economic deprivation in the far north. And I just can't help but feel deeply sad about that, the choice to spend so much more in prisons than to just give whānau, iwi and hapu the resources to help our own people. The third value I'm going to talk about is manaakitanga, which is the act of uplifting someone's mana. It's making people feel welcome. It's the idea that people won't necessarily remember what you say, but they'll remember how you made them feel. And if we apply the value of manaakitanga to COVID recovery efforts, then I think about how we're letting down certain groups of people in particular. People on benefits, people with disabilities, people who didn't have secure housing prior to COVID, and of course, migrant workers. Because if manaakitanga truly guided the systems that govern our lives, then people with disabilities wouldn't have needed to wait for a global pandemic to get the changes that they have been asking for decades, which is increased access to working and learning remotely, reliable food delivery services that they can access from their homes. In fact, if we had already listened to disabled people and built a physically inclusive and accessible society, we would have been better prepared for living in this new reality. For example, if the gaps between store aisles were wider in supermarkets, as they're meant to be for wheelchair users, then everyone would be better able to physically distance from one another. And the same goes for footpaths, of course. If manaakitanga guided our economic system, we would be doing everything we could to ensure everyone, without exception, had a secure home and a guaranteed basic income. And unfortunately, that's just not the case right now for everyone who is on benefits or people who move to this country for a dignified, for a better job. I saw this great meme once that said something like, we should treat houses like dessert, which is that everyone can only get one before other people can go up for seconds. And I actually think that there's a lot in that. I think that there is a lot of wisdom in making sure that all people have the basics: a warm house, access to good health, access to good food, and a secure income. Folks on this call may have seen the Auckland City Mission are saying that rough sleeping has been solved since the COVID crisis struck. And I just think that that is, I think it's deeply sad that we needed to have a pandemic in order to solve homelessness, because it is astounding how quickly we were able to do that. And I hope that all of us remember how quickly we were able to do that once this is over. The fourth and final value that I'm going to talk about today is kotahitanga, which is bringing people together for unity. It is a verb, it's not just a vision, and it requires skillful bridge building, especially in countries as diverse as Aotearoa. And over the last couple of months, I actually think our team of 5 million in New Zealand has displayed incredible kotahitanga. We have worked together to ensure that the most vulnerable people in our communities are safe. I think Jacinda Ardern has been a masterful communicator in leading us through this crisis, but I also think that the most complex challenges are yet to come. Unfortunately, online tools have enabled us to connect across time and space like this, but it has also enabled people who want to spread conspiracy theories, the ability to do that very quickly, very rapidly to lots and lots of people. And I think that, vaccinations are going to be a really important solution as part of our post-COVID reality. And I haven't done a lot of research into this, but I do know that one of the reasons that people distrust experts around vaccinations is because those people themselves have not been trusted by experts. So they have experienced a health professional who has not believed them when they have told them what is going on for them, which has gone on to lead to a distrust of that institution in general. And so there needs to be some kind of restorative justice process put in place to restore trust between citizens and experts, or citizens and institutions, if we are going to build a society based on kotahitanga that goes beyond this. I also think that government needs to be looking at the business models of social media companies, because, the YouTube algorithm learnt a long time ago that what keeps us watching videos on their website is ever more extreme or novel or sensational content. So you can go onto YouTube, which the majority of people under the age of 30 get their news and their entertainment from YouTube. You can go onto YouTube and type in, I want to learn how to be a better jogger, and it will give you a video about running. Or you can say, I want to learn about vegetarian food, and then it will present you with a video about going vegan. Or you can type in something like New Zealand history, and then the next one that they'll present you with is a conspiracy or a lie that there were 7-foot-tall white people with red hair in New Zealand before Māori. And that's a true story, by the way. That is a video that, if you search the word Māori on YouTube, it will come up. It's got more than 500,000 views on it. And it's a video that was actually banned from TVNZ. But YouTube, of course, benefits from having these sorts of videos on their platform, because their whole business model is built on presenting us with ads, or annoying people enough with ads so that they subscribe. And so I really think that that governments, who are the only people that have any power over social media companies in any real way, need to be looking at challenging their business model in order to stop the proliferation of conspiracy theories across time and space, because it's quite dangerous, I think. So finally, if we're serious about building a society based on kotahitanga, I think there needs to be a concerted effort towards building a society based on belonging and inclusion, a society based on listening and trust and whanaungatanga, building familial relationships with one another, power sharing and aroha. And I think if we can do that, then together we can build an Aotearoa that we are truly proud of. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. Happy to obviously answer any questions.
tēnā koe e te rangatira, and this is how we give our applause using sign language, one of our 2 official languages of New Zealand. Little aside, English actually is an official language of New Zealand. It's just Māori and sign, and it's just the default language is the English one, which of course has been a great medium in many ways, because there you are with your legacy thinking. That's what I consider when I hear you talking about whakapapa and that legacy thinking, and how we actually move to a state that is somewhere near a treaty honouring Aotearoa. So I guess that's my first question. And then Leonie, I wonder if you could start to tell us how people can ask questions, because I'm really mindful that sometimes in a big room, it's really hard to ask questions, and maybe it will be easier now that we're on a Zoom hui, or maybe it will be harder. But just, can we talk about that tikanga, and then I'll have a korero with Laura?
Yes, we would love questions from the participants. We have a few already, and if you have a question, just type it into the chat panel, and then I will send it down to Stacey. So up to Stacey,
Right.
down.
So you'll send that in the chat, right?
Yes, in the chat, yeah.
So Mum's got it
It's to you. Yeah.
No reira, e te hoa, Laura, if we can talk about a treaty honouring Aotearoa, what needs to happen in terms of structural change and perhaps other societal changes and shifts in order to get nearer to that?
So I was very lucky recently, and I went to, who organised it? Te Raora organised a Hauora Summit in Wellington, and Tā Mason Jury was speaking there. And it was incredible, because I think sometimes when we talk about this idea of constitutional transformation, and we talk about it being in 2040, it seems really far away and really big. But actually, he was speaking in ways as if like we're almost there. And the examples that he gave is that because of the incredible work of Māori academics, activists, whānau, and of course our allies, our treaty partners over the years, in New Zealand, you can now go from kohanga reo to kura kaupapa to say te wānanga o Aotearoa. So you can go through your entire schooling right now, and you can learn with te reo being your first language, and you can learn from a curriculum based on tikanga and Māori practices and values. And so that already exists. That exists because, years ago, ordinary nannies and aunties and uncles saw that there was a need for our language to be saved, and you'll know obviously a lot more about this than I will, Stacey, but they came together in whatever space they could find to pass on their learnings, to their lessons, their language to the next generation, and that just continued to grow and grow and grow and grow, and now those are fully functional institutions. And so in the education space, we're actually almost there because we have those institutions set up. The problem, of course, is that at the moment, the way that it's administered is that the Crown still holds, the government still holds the decision-making power over how the resources are given to those organisations. So at the moment, what we have is maybe more self-administration than self-determination. But of course, I think self-administration is probably is an important interim step in getting towards self-determination. If we look at another sector, which is health, already there are various kaupapa Māori health providers, sexual health providers, mental health providers all around the country who are delivering services to whānau in distinctly kaupapa Māori ways, in ways that are grounded in mātauranga Māori. But again, those folks are beholden to the whims of political parties who are in power in Parliament. And so what I would like to see is the Crown over time accepting that they need to relinquish or share more of that power with these institutions that already are set up, but in a way that means that it's somewhat separated from the whims of Parliament, because we can't make progress as fast as we would like to, and as fast as I know we are capable of, until they are willing to do that. And so I find that very exciting. There's also, if we look at the justice sector, there are shifts at the moment towards a model called mana o rite, which is basically this idea that at every level of the justice system, which is corrections, justice and police, they are looking at having a Māori person who sits alongside the chief executive of every single one of those ministries, and they would have equal decision-making power with the chief executive, and they would be informed by a team of policy experts and researchers who would do their research in a distinctly kaupapa Māori way to inform those decisions. And so I think that it might sound all really far away, but actually a lot of work is already happening, and so it's about supporting the things that are already happening to grow and looking at the areas that don't yet have that, and starting off new initiatives there.
Kapai, so do you think that that's the approach, almost out of main central government approach is most important, because, or do we need an actual structural change within the government structure of like having 7 Māori seats? Those kind of things, do they need to change? Because sometimes I hear words that sound nice, like consultation and inclusion, but that's not partnership. And if we are the ones who get to include the other partner, we're not in partnership. Nō reira, peha o whakaro, what do you think about the structure of government currently?
Yes, yeah, great question. Yeah, so I guess I was imagining those as being stepping stones towards the acceptance of the need for constitutional transformation. But I think it's important to talk about what like a constitution is, because it's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but without really explaining what it is. But basically a constitution is a set of principles, guidelines, laws that can underpin the decisions that people in power make over the systems that are put in place to govern our lives. And so what Mātiki Mai is advocating for is that we need a constitution that guarantees that we live into the promise of the treaty, which means that the Crown shares power and responsibility for the care of this land and all of the people in it with Māori, but also that all decisions that are made in this land and about this land prioritise the health of Papatuanuku. And then there's a whole bunch of other things. It also goes on to talk about the values that need to guide decision making and things like that. It's really worth reading the report. It's called Mātiki Mai if you haven't read it already. So absolutely we do need structural systemic change, constitutional change. And what I thought was really interesting, I went to Kim Workman's knighthood event recently, and the Governor General, Dame Patsy Reddy, she actually said, you know, I absolutely can see in 2040 we will be called Aotearoa and we will have these separate institutions. They will just be the norm. And so I think that's very promising. I think that there is potentially more support out there than we realise. And I think the more that we have conversations like this, that support can only grow.
I want to quickly talk about the example you gave of the new benefit for newly unemployed, and I guess how easy it is for our society to dehumanize people who are unemployed, or like you and me, grew up with mums on the DPB. Yeah. So where does that change? How do we all participate in that change of how easily we like to grade people in terms of who is worthy of money?
Yeah, that's a really tricky problem, isn't it? Because we are up against a backdrop in which people who wish to hold on to power or grab power have benefited from perpetuating myths about people on benefits. And they do that in pervasive ways, meaning that they take advantage of their platforms to dehumanize people purposefully in order to seize and grab and hold on to power. And so that is really challenging context to operate in. And so that means I think it's really important for us to think about and understand the importance of the words that we use. And so all of us that are here probably have family members or friends that we can think of who probably wouldn't come to a talk like this, who may hold views that are different from yours, but actually by entering into conversation with them, better understanding their thoughts, their fears, their worries, their concerns, and then presenting them with a different way of thinking about things, you can often be surprised by how you can by your own power in shifting that individual's heart or mind. Maybe not all the way, like maybe they won't leave that conversation being like, we must abolish prisons tomorrow, or like, you know, universal basic income for everyone tomorrow. But they could leave, you could plant a seed in that person's mind about how things could be different. And that's because stories are transcendent. Stories have the ability to cut across party lines, to touch people's hearts in a way that is really real, and it's been that way for thousands and thousands of years. And so I think the importance of stories, and I also think the importance of your own personal story, telling your own personal story, and why you think it's important that everyone in Aotearoa has a secure home and enough income to live with dignity and participate fully in their communities, is really compelling. People don't often get the chance to, or people, we don't really curate that many spaces in which we share our dreams and our aspirations with one another. And I think the more intentionally we can do that with more people, the more spaces like that will grow out of that. And so, you know, for the last 18 months, Action Station has been running this project called Tau Iwi Tautoko, which we used to translate as Ngā Māori Acting in Support of Māori. And it's basically a group of mostly Pākehā, but other Tau Iwi as well, volunteers who come together every week for 10 weeks to go into the comment sections online and challenge racism where they see it. And we teach them skills in non-violent communication and restorative justice practices and listening-based approaches. And we have, through that, we have collected the data on those conversations. It's about 1,500 conversations, and we have seen the power of persuasive one-on-one conversations in action when you're doing it from a place of listening and of aroha and empathy. Not everyone. There are some people out there that you will never convince, but the majority of people are in the middle. And so part of the skill is also learning who are the people to spend your energy and your time on as well.
Such a brilliant project, Laura. Such a brilliant project.
Yeah, for actually on the welfare thing, if we are running another version of this called Welfare Tautoko. It's starting it's starting soon. It's starting in June. And we again will be bringing people together to learn how to challenge negative stereotypes about people on benefits or people who have been let down by our economic system. So anyone who is interested in that can follow up with me. My email is laura@actionstation.org.nz, and I can send you the details to join that program.
I just have to pounce on you talking about universal basic income. What would it ideally look like as it came to life as you see it?
I see Sue on this call, and Sue and I had the benefit of being, I had the privilege of being on a webinar not so long ago with Sue, talking about probably a better framing for it that Sue and I talked about was a guaranteed basic income, which is this idea that everyone, regardless of their relationship status or their work status, is entitled to a guaranteed minimum income that is set at livable rates, so that they can ensure that their basic needs are taken care of. I am a real fan of the generous and guaranteed basic income. I think that we could, I think Sue suggested that it could be set at the level of superannuation, or it could be set at the wage subsidy level that we've just seen put through. The reason I'm a fan of it is because it's one of those like systemic, it's one of those, I feel like it's a circuit breaker on the sort of, on the stranglehold that beneficiary bashing and punitive economic policy seems to have on our welfare system at the moment, which is that there seems to be sort of this bipartisan status between Labour and National, when neither of them will do anything courageous when it comes to actually fixing the problems in our welfare system, despite the government's own welfare expert advisory group telling them that there's 120 things they need to do to fix it. And it means that neither of them have taken action, yet at the same time superannuation has an equally interesting bipartisan status, in that until Todd Mueller recently said that he would, both Labour and National said that they aren't willing to raise the age of superannuation. They're not willing to do anything about it. And so from my perspective, a generous guaranteed basic income is a circuit breaker on the stranglehold we're locked in, but because it would also mean that everyone would get used to having a basic income, and that if future politicians tried to take it away, voters would be like, no, don't take that away. And that makes it much more difficult for people to undo in the future. That said, that is just a theory. And so, of course, if the government tomorrow was to extend the new benefit to everyone else that's on the benefit, I would be very happy about that as well.
I'd quickly say how kind it is of you to nail Todd Muller's name when we haven't heard it before last week. Yeah. It goes to show what effort in terms of pronouncing people's names is important. Pera I ngā ingoa Māori. If you don't mind if I just quickly digress, because Sue, I can see you there and I think I feel rude not to at least offer you the opportunity. Is there anything you'd like to add to that? If you don't want to, kei te pai tēnā, kei te pai. Okay, ka pai. So I'll just go on to one of these questions here. How can wāhine Māori make use of the elections in September and referendums?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as many of you will know, Māori are less likely to vote, and that's of course because of our intergenerational distrust of the Crown because of colonisation. So it's completely fair that we're not like, oh yeah, this voting thing really works for us. But also the number of Māori is growing, and that means so is our potential for having sway on the outcomes of elections. And we saw that in the last election with Māori swinging towards Labour in all 7 of the Māori seats, and that helped Labour get into power and helped secure the government that we have today. And so I think we have enormous power, and too often I think that Māori voting is framed in a kind of deficit way, as if like, oh, why aren't the Māori voting enough? And I would like to see us reframe that language to recognise the incredible power that we have, and also to name that actually just being Māori is political, and that voting is not the only way to contribute to political outcomes. And that if you are at Action Station, of course, we engage in select committee processes, we engage in our communities, we engage at our whānau level. There's so many different ways to get involved politically that aren't just that. But of course, voting is one of those tools, and if you choose to, I think it's worth using it. How we can use it, so I guess, I think it remains to be seen, to be honest. I am unsure who I am voting for at this point, to be totally honest. And that is not a position I have found myself in much over the last 10 years. People may know that I ran a campaign called Rock and Roll for a number of years, which was about encouraging more young people to vote. And I'm finding it quite challenging now being confused about who to vote for. And so I also have a lot of aroha for anyone out there who might be confused about who to vote for.
That's a really good way to segue actually into someone who's saying I can't vote for anyone in Parliament because of that feeling of current mistrust. Yeah. So when are you and Leonie Pihamama, Kylie Quintzma, when are you going to set up a viable political alternative? No pressure.
Well, I guess I would argue that Action Station is a viable political alternative, and that I'm already engaging in politics every single day, and that actually what we're trying to do is model a different kind of politics, which is organising around the issues we care about, the values that we share, the vision that we have, and not necessarily this political party that's blue or red or orange or green or whatever that we think is the most important one to be in power. That said, there are also like really incredible people like me who I'm friends with who are running for Parliament, and I think, more power to them, and I hope that they manage to do what it is that they're hoping to do when they get in there. But yeah, I think that maybe Parliament is a bit too bureaucratic and a bit too crowny for me, so probably not in my future.
Can we just talk quickly about the ways that we vote? As a young woman, do you think that it is accessible enough, easy enough? Do we have the right ways of voting physically?
So I'm a real advocate. So Max Rashbrook, who is a researcher, journalist, writer, he did this great paper called Bridges Both Ways. And one of the ideas that he came up with was, I don't know if he came up with it, but in his research, one of the ideas that surfaced was this idea of a Korero politics day, which is that, like, say 6 weeks or 3 months before every election, there should be a public holiday with well-funded community events all around the country where people are invited together to have conversations about the future of the country. And the idea is that it would give people enough time and space before the election to think about who it is that they wanted to vote for. And it would also encourage a more sort of reflective citizenship, and it would bring some of that social act of voting back to our communities. And I think about my own grandmother, and I think about stories that I've been told of when back in the day Māori would come to the marae, get dressed up in their best clothes, and then walk down to vote together once Māori were given the vote, of course. And so I think bringing back some of that social element, the idea that it's a collective act and we're acting in the interests of the collective is one of the ways that we can do that. I'm not really a fan of online voting just because well, for a number of reasons. One is that if someone lives in an abusive relationship, for example, online voting, there is a risk that they could coerce the person who is abusive in that relationship could coerce the other person to vote in the way that they would like them to, and I think that's quite dangerous. But also because, you know, the reasons that people don't vote is that they have distrust of the Crown, they do not believe that their voice matters, and that problem is not going to be solved by putting voting online. That problem will be solved by governments better delivering for people and by bringing that sense of community and that sense of belonging back to people.
Just one interesting point on the structure of votes. If you're in a Māori seat, say I live in Mount Albert, but I actually don't get to participate in a Mount Albert kaupapa because I'm on the Māori roll. But then if I could, I'd actually vote in my iwi rohe, if I could. Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's still some interesting options that we can talk about. I want to read a really well-worded question. Women everywhere have taken a leading role in addressing COVID-19, including wahine Māori, and have been incredibly effective. So how do we embed this manaaki-based leadership by wahine Māori in the post-COVID world as life returns to normal and the focus shifts to economics rather than people? How do we shift to a mokopuna-centric, manaaki-based view of well-being where dollars are just one aspect, not the whole?
Wow, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I think, so what I'm thinking about here is my friend Tina Ngata, she was talking about some research that she did, which is that wahine Māori carry the lion's share of work in so many different roles that they play in their whānau, in their workplace, in their marae, if they're involved in that. And whānau for Māori, of course, is not just your nuclear family, it's your wider whānau. Like I've had my cousin living with me for the last 6 or 7 months because he was having a difficult time going through the justice system, you know, and so that's the reality for Māori. When we talk about these issues, it's not just, it's not like we're not objectively sort of distant from it. It is, you know, in our homes, in our lives, it's something that we're intimately connected to. Like every Māori that you know will have someone in their wider whānau who is going through something with oranga tamariki, or going through something with the justice system, or doesn't have enough money to make ends meet tomorrow, today. And so that's really real, it's very present. But also at the same time, as the person who's written this question has said, wahine Māori show incredible leadership, have incredible ideas about how society could be different, but it's very difficult to make those visions a reality when you're also burdened by all of the things that I just named. And so what I guess I would say is, like, find the wahine Māori in your life who are doing the do and ask them what you can do to help them and help in whatever way that you can. But yeah, I think that's probably what I would suggest.
And sometimes is that debriefing, you know, when you are in those very public roles, how do we tautoko women like you if we don't always want to be the voice at the front like you are?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, I mean, one of the things being an outspoken wahine Māori online with political opinions means that I am subjected to online hate, and I'm pretty resilient and pretty thick-skinned. I think all Māori are. We've had to be to survive, to be here this long, but sometimes on your days where you're tired or you're hungry and things are difficult, it can get really hard, it can get really draining, and you can lose faith and hope. And it could sometimes just be the nice message, tiny message in your DMs or in your email inbox that says something different, that isn't hateful, that is in fact like, hey, I see you, I love the work that you're doing, keep it up. Like, that can be enough sometimes. I also made the decision last year to start seeing I'm very lucky because I'm in a paid position where I can do this and my work pays for it, where I do see a bicultural supervisor on a monthly basis, and that's the kind of thing that I wish was available to everyone. You know, unfortunately in Aotearoa, I think only 5% of our psychotherapists and psychologists are Māori, and I would love for those who have the inclination, who are Māori and are interested in mental health, to, you know, go into that field, and for that to be an aspiration for us, because the more of us who are out there doing that mahi to help with Māori on their journeys of healing, the more healing will happen. Yeah.
And I guess all of us get that energy from being with our people. And so as we are united in this kōrero tonight, ko te tūmanako ia ka whai hua te katoa. I hope that you can all feel that we have been surrounded at least by kōrero that is challenging, that is honest. I know that Budget Day wasn't a great day for you.
No.
And you seem to have worked through a lot since then. How would you describe your feelings and your thoughts on Budget Day?
Yeah, Budget Day was complicated because I guess because I had convinced myself that other people were thinking like me about the COVID crisis. Other people in government were thinking like me about the COVID crisis, which is that a window of opportunity has opened in people's so in politics there's this term called the Overton window, which is basically anything. The Overton window is the frame of what is politically possible, meaning that it's the things that are discussed within sort of mainstream conversations, discourse. Anything that's within that window is what can be passed by people in government. And so as an example, if we think about homosexual law reform, leading up to civil unions, leading up to marriage equality, like each of those steps along the way shifted the Overton window to the point where it became acceptable to the majority for me to just marry my girlfriend. And so that's an example of shifting the Overton window. And I guess I had thought that COVID had presented this opportunity for our semi-progressive government to step through that window, open the Overton door, and do something a little more transformative. And I had really hoped that that is what the budget would do. And then that is not what the budget did. And then I was reminded, and then I was very frustrated, and I tweeted a lot of my frustrations. But then I remembered that through conversations with mostly older activists who have been through this kind of stuff before, I remembered that my theory of change, which is the belief I have about how change happens in the world, has never actually really sat with people in government. It sits with the power of ordinary people connecting like this and working together in our various ways with our various skills to create that change, to create the waves of people power that crash on the walls of Parliament so that people in government listen and then take action. And so that's why I was able to move through those emotions. But yeah, the budget was interesting because Grant Robertson referenced the Labour government after the Great Depression a lot in his speech, and he talked about how brilliant it was that the Labour government at that time invested lots of money in building state houses. But what he failed to mention in his speech is that when in building those state houses, the government gave Fletcher's, the company that owns Ihu Mātau, a whole bunch of money to build those houses. They failed to deliver those houses within budget, so government bailed them out, and that meant that at the time, Fletcher's likely wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the Labour government at that time bailing them out. So they likely wouldn't exist today if it wasn't for that. And fast forward 100 years down the track, or 80 years down the track, and what we have now is Ihu Mātau still owning, Fletcher's still owning Ihu Mātau, refusing to give it back to mana whenua, taking $67 million more from the government in wage subsidies, and then firing a bunch of their workers while their CEO still makes $5 million a year. And, I just thought that was a really important part of the story. And, you know, another part of the story that Grant missed out in talking about the rebuild post the Great Depression is that Māori weren't actually allowed in state houses at the time by the Crown. Māori, so state houses were primarily built for middle class Pākehā at that time. And so we have this really great romanticized idea about what state houses were, but they actually weren't that great for Māori at the beginning. And I think it's important, if we think about whakapapa, to remember that history so that it can inform our future.
Okay. I'm sorry to take you back to that place, but we're probably going to stay there actually, because here's our next question. There is a sudden increase in police power, yet no increase in regards to accountability. We already know that there is a proven racial bias with regards to treatment against Māori from New Zealand police. So what is being done to fix this? What are we going to do to protect our hapori? What do you want to see happening in this area?
Yeah, that's great. So the increase in police powers is a shocking one, because it doesn't exist in a vacuum, because of course before that we had a 6-month trial of armed police in communities that are predominantly Māori and Pacifica, and the justification for that trial was the March 15 terror attacks, which, you know, was conducted by a white supremacist. So having armed police patrolling predominantly brown communities in response to a white supremacist attack seems quite odd, right? So that was, you know, that happened, and thankfully that stopped now, but not without people making a big deal about it. And we heard the news about the police having a trial of facial recognition technology, and they did that without signing that off with the Privacy Commissioner, and without actually signing it off with the highest level bosses within the New Zealand Police. And what's quite shocking about that facial recognition technology is that the reason that they ran it is because facial recognition, sorry, it's just so ridiculous that you laugh, otherwise you'll cry. But basically facial recognition technology is built by white people, so it only really recognizes white people's faces, and so they had to run the trial in order to run it on brown faces so that it could better recognize brown faces, which is awful. And so, yeah, so we had increased police powers through the Public Health Response Bill, the armed police trial, and then facial recognition technology, which is all just awful, awful stuff. And so there's a lot that needs to be done around the reformation of our justice system and the reformation of police. And I think, if I could be frank with people, I think that there is a growing consensus with people in New Zealand that we have a mental health crisis. And the reason that people know that is because we all know someone who has been touched by or affected by mental ill health. And I think that there is a growing consensus among people that we need mental health first responses to incidents of family violence or incidences of harm within our society, rather than armed police first responses. I think that that's a window into people's empathy and understanding because the issue with public security does evoke a lot of fear, and that's something we have to be cognizant of when we're talking about our solutions. And so if people are coming from a fear space, we need to work out how we can bring that fear down so that we can present our solutions in a way that means that they'll hear them. And so one of the things that we're advocating for at Action Station is, hey, instead of teams of armed police being sent out to respond to these incidences of harm, let's send out teams of de-escalation experts. Let's send out teams of mental health, trauma-informed, culturally responsive, specialists. Let's send out teams of people who are experts in restorative justice or counselling. They might go along with police officers, but let's send out people who are experts in mental health first responses along with these folks. And I think that will result in better outcomes for our people, because resource flow will also mean that it's being put towards those people who do the work of healing and caring and relationship building within our society.
And you were talking about that in terms of kaupapa Māori approach to less band-aid type solutions. So do you think that needs to be led from a current existing kaupapa Māori organisation or framework, or do we need a new addition to what is, I guess, the police force?
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment there are, so there's a couple of things going on. So in Wellington right now, there is a trial already underway where police are partnering with paramedics and mental health professionals, including some kaupapa Māori health providers, in order to respond to incidents when police are called. And so that trial's underway. I think there's a lot that we can learn from that that could be scaled up to other areas. But I think if we're embodying a truly Māori way of doing things, then it would be about councils, police working with their local hapu in their local area, and they would make sure that solutions are fit for purpose in that rohe, because of course hapu are best to decide, or they know their communities best, and so are best to think about the solutions that would work for their people in those areas. There is another trial that's underway that I also think has promise in terms of overcoming racial bias, racism within the police. There's an app called Afi, which is a sort of it's a sort of problematic co-option of a really lovely word, but it stands for alternative ways of helping with intervention. And the idea is that police have the ability to refer people to social services on the spot rather than sending them to, say, court, where they may end up in prison or with lots of fines or whatever. And so Afi enables people, so say if someone is struggling with mental distress or addiction, then it enables them to refer people to a appropriate social service. And in the case of Māori, my hope would be, of course, that they are referring people to kaupapa Māori providers. It also, for example, if they pull someone over who is driving without a license, which is a common a common way that Māori enter into our justice system, or are sucked into our justice system, really. It's not like we just walk in because we love it. They can refer them to a driver's licensing program where they can maybe get a grant or something like that, so that they can sit their license, or they can get support to sit their license. And so what Afi does is it gives us data on who are the individual police officers that are referring people to social services rather than courts, and who are they doing it for, and who are they not doing it for. And when we have that data, it means that we can drill right in to who, to which police officers are acting from a place of racial bias, which is the preferred term, or unconscious bias, the preferred term for racism, and we can manage that racism accordingly. We can put those individual police officers into workshops, trainings, decolonization trainings, and any number of ways that we can deal with that bias.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's, my 65-year-old father still getting stopped and asked if his car is his own car. No reira, yeah, as you say, wena ahotanga katoa. And this kind of does follow along another question here. What remedies will mana wahine claimants to the Waitangi Tribunal, I believe, demand of government to fix the labour market inequities that so impoverish Māori women and their whānau?
Oh, wow. I'm probably not the best person to answer that question because I'm not a mana wahine claimant. But what I guess I would say is that, we have known for a long time in New Zealand that there is a racial wealth gap. Statistics New Zealand data shows that the average Pākehā has a median net wealth of $114,000, and your median Māori has $29,000, and so it's a big gap, and part of that reason is because we don't recognise the work that Māori women do in our societies and our communities and our whānau every single day in a way that means that we pay them for that work. And so one of the things that we need to be doing is, of course, recognising the work of care within those communities and making sure that it is paid accordingly. I'm sure there'll be a lot of other really interesting insights that come out of that inquiry, but I wouldn't be the best person to speak to that at this point.
That's a good answer. And it's great to see some more coming through, so I'll try to jump into as many questions as I can in the time we have left. What's the best way, in your opinion, for Pākehā New Zealanders to support this kōrero without taking ownership of tikanga and mana, which is not ours to claim? How do we best amplify the voice of Māori to ensure that these voices are heard and guarantee a constitution?
That's great. I think one of the things when I talked to Moana Jackson, who is obviously a mentor and an idol to so many of us, is he one of the things, because obviously we talk about, I talked to him about progress that he's seen in in his lifetime and since he's been doing this work. And one of the things he says where he's seeing the biggest amount of progress is the prevalence of tauiwi non-Māori turning up for us, of our treaty partners turning up in very real ways, be it with their money, with their time, with their creativity, network, skills, energy, passions. And I think that that's great. And that's not just Pākehā, that's other tauiwi as well. And I think probably one of the most important things I would say is to get very clear about what it is that is your specific skill that you're offering, and what it is that you find, or what it is that you have to contribute to the movement. Because if you can get clear on that, it means that you can offer that, rather than going to some Māori person and being like, hey, how do I help you? You know, and expecting Māori again to do more work, by figuring out on top of what we're doing, what you need to do. And so I think that's a big one, is doing a lot of self-reflection and working out what it is that you have to offer the movement, and then offering that to the movement. There are also like a bunch of really cool groups that you can join. There's Tauiwi Mō Māteke Mai on Facebook, which I think is like 1,300 members now, which is a group of tauiwi who believe in and work for a decolonised New Zealand, who want to see constitutional transformation in our lifetime and are working and supporting one another to make that happen. There's the Tauiwi Tautoko program that I mentioned that Action Station runs, which is tauiwi learning how to challenge racism together. The idea being that you practice online, but then you take that conversation into your boardroom or your workplace or your family dinner or wherever it might be. So that, because the thing is that Pākehā are going to be privy to the types of racism that we are not going to be privy to, because people will filter that out in front of us, but they may not filter it out in front of you. And so having the tools to deal with that when you see it and hear it, in a way that helps dismantle it, I think is really important.
Another question has come in: what role do the unions have to play in this vision?
Yeah, that's great. I think what's really interesting is that the unions so we've been advocating along with others for a very long time around increasing income support, changing the way our welfare system works. And one of the things we've been doing over the last couple of months is we've been trying to build better relationships with the unions, because one of the reasons that we've been unable to achieve as much progress as we would like when it comes to welfare reform is because workers are often pitted against people who are on welfare. And that division is very intentional. There's that narrative of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, the working poor and the people on benefits, is something that only people who want to hoard wealth and power benefit from. We people, ordinary people, do not benefit from that narrative. And yet it's a very difficult narrative to challenge because it's so pervasive in so many areas. And so we've been making a real effort over the last little while to build a stronger relationship of solidarity with unions in the hope that they would advocate for welfare reform. And to their credit, some people in the unions have been stepping up and doing that, which I think is really, really great. I think one of the things that unions offer, or historically has offered prior to really the denigration of unions through laws that wanted to erode worker power and in the interest of exploitative employers, is political education, is spaces for political education, where unions would help educate traditionally a lot of working class white males about who the real enemy is, which is, capitalism and exploitative employers, as opposed to people of colour who have moved here for a better life. And so unfortunately, with the erosion of unions over time, which has been deliberate by people who don't want to see workers have and seize their, take, control, or grab hold of their own power, we have also lost those spaces for political education. And Sue, again, she works in a very great place for political education, Kōtari. And I think those of us who are predisposed towards teaching and facilitating workshops and things like that should, if we can, be making more of an effort to create more of those spaces where we can educate one another about who we are in our political society, about our own power to change the decisions that affect our lives if we work collectively. Because I think that, if because unfortunately the unions aren't able to do that in the way that they used to anymore because of the lack of resources. So I guess my answer is two-pronged. One, the unions could do more political education, and two, those of us who are predisposed to do that can help by also engaging in political education.
Kapai, and this is talking about a different type of education, or I guess reclamation. What are your thoughts around whakapapa, teaching our kōrero Māori and uplifting them to avoid poverty of mind, regardless of where they come from, to bring their own rangatiratanga?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Sorry, can you say it again?
I think it may be a vision as well. So,
right.
Yeah, teaching our kōrero Māori,
yeah,
a way to be, basically to understand that they have rangatiratanga, mindless of where they come from, to avoid poverty that is a poverty of thought. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, well, I do think Māori are spoken about so often, as I said earlier, in ways that are deficit, and that contributes to internalized racism that many of us carry for a very long time until, and it, like, so if I talk about myself, I was like placed in the gifted and talented programs when I was younger. I went to predominantly Pākehā schools, and I was the only Māori in those classes. I'm really opposed to streaming. I think streaming is awful. It tells young people from a very young age that you're this or you're that, and that builds their narrative and their story of self, which makes it incredibly difficult to overcome if that's the story that you've embedded in yourself from a very young age. And so I was the only Māori in these classes. And that meant that I thought that there was something wrong with me. And it actually wasn't until I went traveling and moved up. Yeah, so I probably would have thrived in a university environment, but I didn't want to go to university because I thought I would be the only Māori at the university. And I didn't want it to be this really tokenizing experience, which is what I had experienced at school to date. Like anytime Māori got brought up, in my class, they would all look at me like, oh, what does she think? And so I started, and then at the same time, the only representations I saw of myself in media were stories about South Auckland and crime, right? And so I developed the story about myself that was completely incorrect from a very young age. And it wasn't until I went overseas and I was doing woofing, which is where you willfully work on organic farms in exchange for food and accommodation. And I was working in Croatia, and I learned about the Yugoslavian wars there, and I was hanging out with people who had fought really long and hard for retaining their cultural identity, and it made me realize that I came from this group of people who are really unique and really amazing, and there's not very many of us in the world, and actually I should have incredible pride about that. And that was a real moment of shifting for me, because I started to think about Māori in a really aspirational, positive way. But of course, not every young Māori is lucky enough to go and live in Croatia and have this moment. And so absolutely, I think that if we can teach young Māori from a very young age that we are our tupuna, and our tupuna are incredible, then we will only see good things come from that, I think.
And who we descend from, as you said at the beginning, nanga the ira atua wahine, that it's everything in our kōrero has always been this power. But it's interesting because, and thank you for sharing that really personal kōrero, because you felt that way. You had to go overseas to find that pride and to break down a story you were being told in New Zealand. And I felt the same in Japan, because the value of learning Japanese language was elevated, and I realized that I had my deep learning for my own language. And yet, say, my husband, he was in a gifted class as well, so they were offered French and German, and it wasn't until the bottom streams that you were offered, guess what, Te Reo Māori. So while we're here talking about your personal story, someone's asked if you had an aha moment when you realized that you are a feminist.
Oh, yeah, great question. I've had lots of aha moments. Because I have the kind of personality where I'm like, this is the way, and then I just run at it. And so yeah, when I traveled overseas, I the reason I moved overseas is because I wanted to work on music festivals, because I really love the idea of bringing people together for shared experiences of joy and happiness and laughter and fun. And so I went to go and work on Glastonbury Music Festival as a volunteer coordinator, coordinating the people who did like the picking up of the rubbish and recycling and waste and all of that kind of stuff, which is actually quite a cool model, because basically the way it works is Glastonbury pays Oxfam and Oxfam send volunteers. And so it's like this really nice reciprocal model. So I was organising a lot of volunteers doing that, but of course that's just seasonal work in the summer, and so I had to get other work, and so I ended up becoming a charity fundraiser. And then I was like, charities are the way. I'm just like, this is what I need to do. I found my way to give back to the world. And then when I came back to New Zealand, I continued to do that work, but I wanted to organise events that bring together that basically raise money for charities. And so I was bringing those two pieces of work together. But, and so that's what I did. And then through that, I found, it was an election year coming up, and I found out that young people weren't voting in very high numbers. And then Tom Scott, who's this rapper from West Auckland, was like, oh, I want to run these parties where if people promise to vote, they can come in for free and they have to enroll on the door. And I was like, oh, great, I should do that. And so I ended up doing that. So I sort of just fell into all of these things. But along the way, I have, I guess, had firstly incredible wise women who have helped guide me in that decision making, that just sort of appear and they're like, here's what you need to do next. But also through that work with Oxfam and in those charities, I learned that I learned about horrible gender-based discrimination all around the world. But I also learned about things like microlending, where if you give women money in communities that are impoverished, they will do incredible things with it for their entire community. And so I learned about both the horrible treatment of women, but also the incredible power of women when they're given the resources to, you know, self-determine their future. And so I would say there wasn't really like a aha moment, but there's just been like so many various moments over my life that have led me to believe, to have the positions that the political positions that I hold today. Yeah.
Okay, and this is a good follow-on question. Can you please talk, Laura, more about the phrase internalized racism?
Oh, sure. So internalized racism, I mean, I'm not sure what the academic meaning of it, but my understanding of it it is where you've heard so many messages over such a long time that you start to internalize or believe inside yourself some of the messages that you have heard. So if we live in a society that is just drowning in messages that Māori are lesser than, or people on benefits are lesser than, or whatever other marginalised group is lesser than, some of those messages start to sink in and you start to believe them and adopt them as your story, or the belief or the narrative that you have about yourself. And that can show up in lots of different ways for lots of different people, especially if you aren't aware of that, because, you know, a lot of our thoughts are unconscious. They just come to our mind. It's not like we automatically think those things. But if we acknowledge that internalized racism exists and we have a racist thought that comes into our head, we have to acknowledge that and then do the work to overcome that, because actually it's not necessarily our fault that some of those thoughts are in there, because we live in a society where those messages are just pumped out again and again and again. And so it takes work for us to overcome them. But the other, building on that, I guess there is also lateral violence, which is this idea that communities who are marginalised have been pitted against each other for so long by people who are in power, that you can also have internalised racism about communities that aren't your own but are also marginalised. So for a Māori person, that might show up as having racism towards migrants of colour. I know that it definitely does in some members of my whānau, and that's the difficult conversations that I try to have when I go home about that. And so it's also about recognising that sometimes internalised racism can show up in ways that means that we become laterally violent, violence that goes sideways to people who are equally marginalised or oppressed or neglected to us. And I think that a really important piece of work that we are all going to need to do over the coming years as we head towards 2040 is what can we do to foster inclusion, understanding, belonging, because by 2040, Asian, Māori and Pasifika people will be the majority population in Aotearoa, and there are going to be a lot of Pākehā who feel deep discomfort over that. But the more that we can weave people together and weave understanding, the more likely it is that we will live into the promise of Te Tiriti, which is a society in which we share power and responsibility for the care of this land and all of the people in it. And we're lucky because we have that as a model, which means we don't have to invent something from scratch.
Can I just quickly pick up on what you were talking about with lateral violence? I've seen Dr. Hinemoa Elder use it in talking about how Māori can sometimes do that to Māori. Have you witnessed that as well? And do you have korero to share about that?
Yeah, it's hard. I think that's probably like, of all the hate that I would get, that's definitely the hardest. And I think we just have to be honest about that, and also gentle with that, in that recognizing that there are a lot of things that have happened as a result of colonization, which continues today. Like, we still live in a colonized country. Let's not talk about it as if it's some abstract thing in the past. And that turns up in ways that are hurtful, harmful, and that means, and it's important, I guess, for us to think about how we support more healing to happen in more collective ways. And that could be singing together, it could be learning together, it could be sharing food together, like all of those sorts of things. But it's also about setting personal boundaries for ourselves as well, I think, which means being really honest with yourself about how things are affecting you, because you need to have a full cup to deal with life as well. And that requires taking responsibility for yourself. Yeah, and I guess you're saying understanding where it's coming from.
Yes. Because it is so very hurtful, it's hard not to just respond with hurt.
Yes, but absolutely.
That's really good insight, and a generous insight. So I think this may be our last question. Would you recommend asking political candidates and parties what they commit to offering wahine Māori?
I would recommend, so like there's a couple of different things, like tactic strategies that you can use in order to lift politicians' gaze towards being more aspirational when it comes to serving wahine Māori, but also when it comes to holding them to account for falling short when it comes to serving wahine Māori. One that I really love is the Living Wage movement run these like town halls every year where they first of all, they do a lot of work to build the power of their community. So they bring people together, every week to get to know each other, to turn up for one another, and to work towards a reality in which everyone has at least a living wage. And then once they have that power, they host an event where they invite politicians to come along to a town hall event with, say, 300, 400 people. And they ask those politicians to commit in front of these 300, 400 people to a living wage. And then those politicians say, oh, yeah, absolutely, yes, I support a living wage, because, of course, they're trying to win votes at the election. And some of them will actually support the living wage, and they will work really hard to try and make that happen. And then what you have is a politician on the record in front of 400 people saying, I support this thing happening. And that gives you the power to then say, oh, but you said at this event, at this time, in front of 400 of us, that you support that. So what have you done to actually make that happen? And so I think that's a really effective strategy, but it works best when you have first built your power before you spend your power, meaning that you've done the work of building your community, of building your campaign, and then you bring in the decision maker and hold them to account for that. But that said, I also think that politicians have phones, they have email addresses, we can get in contact with them on an individual basis as well. They have Twitter accounts, most of them. But it's also about having conversations with our fellow voters, with our whānau, with our friends, and encouraging them to make a vote that prioritises the health of people and planet, but also letting them know that it's not just that democracy doesn't end at the ballot box. It's about what we do after the election as well.
Tēnā rawa atu koe te uri o te ao kapurangi. Tēnei ka mihi ki a koe. I think of you and I think of your ancestor, te ao kapurangi, who is famous for saving thousands of our people through using her intelligence and strategy. For koe tana momo. And I see that in you, and I see that so many of us have come together tonight and we'll all have lots of ideas whirring in our heads. We've done so well to space this time out. Thank you for the commitment that you've made to be here. And thank you so much, Laura, for all of your mahi. Kia mōhio mai koe, whenever you are standing, that this is just a sample of the women and the men. I see you, Sean, that are with you. So kia kahara koe. Mai kore ake koe, and thank you so much. Tūtawa mai runga, tūtawa mai raro. Tūtawa mai roto, tūtawa mai waho. Kia tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora ki te katoa, haumie, hui e tae ke. Turuki, turuki, paneke, paneke. Turuki, turuki, paneke, paneke. Haumie, hui e tae ke. Mauri ora kia tātou.